begins.
That was my line! Do you want to give me the case notes now? Fuck off. Amidst the production of Batman and Robin in 1996, Warner Brothers, who were said to have been impressed with the dailies for that film, were already making proposals for a fifth Batman movie, supposedly titled Batman Triumphant. Now there's an optimistic title if ever I heard one. With Joel Schumacher, who had made both Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, returning as director, and new screenwriter Mark Protosevich replacing Akiva Goldsman would write the script. The story would have had the Scarecrow be the new villain and would also feature the Joker returning as a hallucination caused by the Scarecrow's nerve toxin, as well as Harley Quinn, here reimagined as the Joker's daughter, as a supporting character preoccupied with killing Batman for the death of her father at the end of Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie, spoiler warning. Obviously enough, it never happened as a result of Batman and Robin being both critical and financial disaster. That is to say, Batman and Robin still made Warner Brothers millions, just not as many millions as they were hoping for, inasmuch as it didn't gross higher than the previous three Batman movies. So the plans for Triumphant were scrapped almost immediately, instead opting to focus on creating a Batman Beyond project based on the popular cartoon series, and an adaptation of Frank Miller's acclaimed Batman Year One. Whichever of those two was the most satisfactory to the studio executives would be the project that would get the green light. Whilst that was going on, in mid-1989, Lee Shapiro and Stephen Wise pitched an idea for a movie called Batman Dark Knight, which would have had Batman retire and Robin attend Gotham University, where, unbeknownst to him, Jonathan Crane, aka the Scarecrow, would be using his joint position as Professor of Psychology and Head Psychiatrist at Arkham Asylum to conduct horrifying experiments into human fear, in the process accidentally turning a colleague of his, Dr. Kirk Landstrom, into the Man-Bat, who, when unleashed onto Gotham, the public believe is Batman's bloodthirsty return. The real Batman would then come out of retirement to clear his name and figure out exactly what's going on. Warner Brothers ultimately decided to take a pass on it because they were still waiting for what was happening with the Batman Beyond and Batman Year One projects. What was happening was that by the year 2000, both projects were still in development. Bose Yakin, who was also asked to direct Batman Beyond as well as co-write it with Paul Dini and Neil Stephenson, began to lose interest, and the project was then scrapped by Warner Brothers in favour of the Batman Year One project. Despite Joel Schumacher being really eager to direct, seeing as his original plans for Batman before Batman Forever were to make an adaptation of Year One anyway, indie filmmaker darling Darren Aronofsky, who had just come off the critically lauded Requiem for a Dream, was set to direct and co-write the movie alongside Frank Miller himself, a task that Aronofsky enthusiastically embraced, claiming that we'd be seeing a version of Batman that no one had ever seen before, whilst at the same time Warner Brothers were planning on spinning off Catwoman into her own movie, which was, oh dear. Anyway, unfortunately though, the Batman Year One project was dropped in 2003. No one knows the exact reason why, but it is known that Warner Brothers became more interested in the prospects of a Batman vs Superman movie, so Darren Aronofsky would later go off to write and direct The Fountain, which was released in 2006 after an extremely troubled production. And it's at this point you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, a Batman vs Superman movie, you say? Well, yeah, it turns out Warner Brothers tried this about 13 years ago. So, in 2002, J.J. Abrams, who was beginning to make a name for himself in the industry during the run of his widely popular TV series Alias, pitched a screenplay called Superman Flyby that would reboot the Superman movies after several projects had previously failed to get it off the ground.
But then all of a sudden, like a giant fucking spider shows up.
Superman Flyby was greenlit by Warner Brothers with McGee to direct, but he soon dropped out to work on Charlie's Angels Full Throttle instead. Warner Brothers then turned to Wolfgang Peterson to direct, but roughly at the same time, screenwriter Andrew Kevin Walker pitched a project that would put Batman and Superman together in the same movie, to which Warner Brothers assigned Peterson to direct, and instead of going with Abrams' screenplay, they then hired Akiva Goldsman to rewrite Walker's original draft. Goldman's screenplay was set to have Batman go through a mental breakdown after a 5-year retirement from crime fighting. I don't know if you're noticing a theme in any of these failed Batman projects. With no one to help him, Robin, Alfred and Commissioner Gordon having died at this point, he ultimately finds solace in his fiancée Elizabeth Miller, whilst at the same time Superman struggles with his recent divorce from Lois Lane. Elizabeth Miller, however, would then swiftly be killed by the Joker on their honeymoon, and Batman swears revenge while Superman desperately tries to hold him back. Ultimately blaming the death of his loved one on Superman, the two become bitter enemies and get into a massive fight. Eventually all of this would be revealed to be a plot masterminded by none other than Lex Luthor to get Batman and Superman to destroy each other, and the two become friends again to take down Luthor. Christian Bale, who was also asked to appear as the same character in Aronofsky's Batman Year One project, was asked to play Batman, and Josh Hartnett was approached for the role of Superman. Unfortunately, again, none of this ended up happening because J.J. Abrams repitched another draft of Superman Flyby, and Warner Brothers became more interested in separating the two into their own movies. So down the line, the next Superman movie to be released was Bryan Singer's Superman Returns in 2006, with Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins coming out in 2005. And even though J.J. Abrams' Superman Flyby project ended up not happening, traces of its screenplay can be seen in 2013's Man of Steel. As for Batman vs Superman, in 2007 it was included as a background reference in I Am Legend, as as an in-joke, as Akiva Goldsman had written the screenplay for that movie also. Christopher Nolan was officially hired by Warner Bros. In January of 2003 to direct a Batman project whilst hot off the heels of his last film, Insomnia. Originally, Christopher Nolan had another project lined up to make a biopic on the great innovative and eccentric filmmaker and pioneer Howard Hughes. That project never came to fruition because Martin Scorsese was already in pre-production to make The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio, which actually was a biopic on Howard Hughes. Luckily for Nolan, he found another reclusive billionaire to make a movie about. Openly stating his intention to reinvent the Caped Crusader by simply creating a whole movie dedicated to the origin story, Nolan ended up collaborating with screenwriter David S. Goyer on the script, whilst Goyer would be tasked with laying out the story. Borrowing heavy influence from The Man Who Falls, The Long Halloween and Batman Year One, they aimed to create a Batman with themes of humanity and realism as the basis, deeming the previous Batman movies to be exercises in style rather than substance, aesthetically placing them as something other than Tim Burton's gothic comic-inspired films and Joel Schumacher's 60s-inspired colourful camp. Christian Bale was soon hired for the role of Bruce Wayne, having just come off The Machinist and putting weight back on from having almost lost all of it in preparation for that film, and the rest of the cast was quickly assembled afterwards, consisting of Michael Caine, Gary Oldman, Katie Holmes, Liam Neeson, Morgan Freeman and Cillian Murphy. Batman Begins commenced principal photography in March 2004. Over the course of 129 shooting days, the production filmed on location in Iceland, Chicago and London, before wrapping in September to meet a June 2005 release date during the summer blockbuster period. So now it's 2005 and fans have been eagerly awaiting a new Batman movie for 8 years at this point. This is what Christopher Nolan gave them. The movie opens with Bruce Wayne as a child running around his back garden with a young Rachel Dawes, where he suddenly falls down a well which contains a small cave infested with bats which promptly attack him, at which point we cut many years later to Bruce Wayne as an inmate in a Bhutanese prison as an adult. The script and editing choice of putting these two scenes together, of course, is meant to convey a sense of time. The second event in this context is more or less a direct result of the first. It's a very interesting foot to start the movie out on, not a bad one, mind. I'm just trying to make the point that these first two scenes already say a lot about Christopher Nolan's intent of direction for the character. Assuming most of you already know the Batman origin story, Christopher Nolan and David Goyer essentially take the idea of Batman and his place within his own mythos and reframes it as a psychological character piece, telling the biggest and most thoroughly laid out interpretation of the origin story the Batman movies have had thus far. As condensed as I can make it, the story goes chronologically that Bruce Wayne suffered a childhood trauma by falling down a well and being attacked by bats. Shortly thereafter, his parents die at the hands of a mugger by the name of Joe Chill. Several years later, he returns from a college education at Princeton to watch the testimony Chill makes in court at the expense of a crime boss by the name of Carmine Falcone. Bruce almost shoots him, but is taken out before anyone else can get close enough. He's then reintroduced to Rachel Dawes, who's actively working to loosen the iron fist of Falcone's crime syndicate, and sternly explains to Bruce that the nature of Gotham's levels of crime and corruption are far more complicated than Bruce is able to small-mindedly comprehend, a statement reinforced with an impromptu meeting with Carmine Falcone himself. Soon afterwards, Bruce falls under the radar and becomes a criminal in an attempt to understand criminality in its purest form, leading him to the prison we saw at the beginning of the film. He's then saved by a mysterious figure by the name of Henry Ducard, who trains him to be an assassin in a secret clan by the name of the League of Shadows, whom Bruce rejects when he fails to take another man's life, very much burning that bridge behind him. Upon his return to Gotham City, utilising all the training, knowledge and experience he's acquired, Bruce then starts making plans to become the symbol of hope that his father once was, and thus Batman Begins. The first thing to say, of course, is that the title is completely literal. The movie is about Batman and what Batman represents as a figure within the context of his own universe, and by extension, the then current pop culture landscape. The thing that I like most about Batman Begins is that it never talks down to its audience. I mean, sure, occasionally the philosophising on part of the screenplay is sometimes a bit tough to fully understand, but under Christopher Nolan's watch, there'll be no hand-holding in this new series. What's particularly of note here is that back in 2005, the term reboot didn't exactly exist, nor did superhero movies that are actually about the central character rather than the central character fighting some sort of greater evil. In summary, no one had ever really tried to do this before. It's always interesting to me how a filmmaker, or just artists in general, approach a new idea, particularly when said ideas become the bedrock for subsequent works. I'm pretty sure that Christopher Nolan and David Goyer had no idea that things would turn out the way they did en masse. I mean, who on earth sits down and goes, hey guys, let's revolutionise a well-established genre spurned on by wishful thinking and crossed fingers? But what's so interesting about Batman Begins as a cultural work is how right they got this thing to work in the first place. I'll repeat for emphasis, nobody had ever really tried to do this before. In other words, Batman Begins as a cultural touchstone is very much seen as the Watchmen of comic book superhero movies, although I think you'll find that Watchmen is the Watchmen of comic book superhero movies, but shut up, my point is, the act of reviewing Batman Begins serves double duty, as we're not only talking about the reinvention of a superhero in and of itself, we're also talking about the reworking of the superhero genre by and large, and by extension reviewing the last 10 years of blockbuster filmmaking. Simply put, the amount of stuff that now dominates the pop culture landscape as a result of this one movie that can be directly or indirectly linked back to it is frankly awe-inspiring. To reword a famous quote about Pablo Picasso, there's blockbuster filmmaking before and after Batman Batman Begins, at least in terms of what's happening now. So let's actually get down to business and talk about the movie, starting with the structure of the script, or more specifically the visual language Nolan employs in telling this story. Whilst Christopher Nolan has never been a particularly great visual storyteller, he almost always makes up for it with his incredible sense of editing. Now, I'm not going to claim to be the greatest expert or even practitioner of editing, considering I hacksaw the shit out of these videos just to get my voiceovers to sound consistent, and incidentally, hello to myself cutting this very video together a couple of days after I recorded this.
Hello.
But my basic understanding of film language in terms of editing is that a cut can mean several things as a storytelling device. It can mean and then, or it can mean meanwhile, or it can mean simply compare through juxtaposition between two images. If you're interested in a more literal depiction of this, storytelling through editing plays out a lot like this. We meet Bruce Wayne and Alfred in the Batcave whilst Bruce is carving a batarang. Alfred says,
"Why bats, Master Wayne?"
And then Bruce says,
"Bats frighten me. This time my enemies shared my dread."
And then Bruce throws the batarang he carved into a pillar, impaling it into the wall. Or another example from The Dark Knight. Batman talks to Jim Gordon about sacrificing himself. Meanwhile, Jim Gordon destroys the bat signal with an axe. Meanwhile, Alfred burns Rachel's letter to Bruce. Meanwhile, Lucius Fox turns off the supercomputer, and then Batman rides off into the night. And of course, the opening of this movie. Bruce Wayne, as a child, falls into the well and is attacked by bats. Cut to many years later as an adult, waking from that event as if it were a nightmare. Two separate moments juxtaposed over a single cut to imply a sense of time and evolution. What's always fascinated me is Christopher Nolan's editing choices, precisely when he decides to use each of these types of cuts. This actually goes a long way in explaining Christopher Nolan's favoured non-linear storytelling style, which is why it's somewhat important to note that this is Christopher Nolan's first really big movie, and it would also be the first time that mainstream audiences would get a taste of what a Christopher Nolan movie is. So in a nutshell, that's the beginnings of Nolan's approach towards his idea of what a Batman movie could be. As we've discussed before, Christopher Nolan as an auteur draws heavily from elements of both existentialism and the film noir genre, and it's no surprise that their influences both appear in this interpretation of the character. In other words, attempting to ground an ostensibly fantastical superhero initially created for children in a modern realism-laden context, making Batman less of a superhero and more of a super detective. The only problem I have by going the realism route is that by making excuses for the more realistic aspects of the story, you inadvertently end up making the more comic booky aspects stick out more prominently, a bit like penises in a Calvin Klein ad. Now, as for his treatment of Batman, both as a character and as a concept within his universe, well, Batman's a bit of a strange hero to write about when you think about it. In order to create a coherent story about a guy dressing as a giant bat fighting crime, you have to characterise the man in such a way that his dressing up in a mask and cape and kicking drug dealers up the arse every night seems to make sense, without him ceasing to be an admirable or at least somewhat sympathetic figure. Different writers over the years have approached this problem in different ways at different times. Mark DiPaolo of Oklahoma City University has described the character of Bruce Wayne as generally resembling a kind of quasi-medieval feudal lord. He is the scion of a plutocratic connected family, hell, he is frequently referred to as the Prince of Gotham, but rather than just indulging himself, he feels a noble responsibility to the ordinary citizens of his dynastic set, and so as Bruce Wayne, he contributes via foundations and charity galas, the conventional tools of a benevolent princeling. But he also engages with the hostile, parasitic underbelly of Gotham by donning a literal Dark Knight persona. In this respect, Batman closely resembles the Scarlet Pimpernel, the heroic alter ego of the respectable Percy Blakeney, and to a greater extent Johnston McCulley's swashbuckling Zorro, a secret identity adopted by a California nobleman, Don Diego de la Vega, in order to fight oppression. Both characters themselves, of course, owe a great debt to the legend of Robin Hood. Zorro was an important inspiration for the character of Batman, both to the writers and within the comics mythology to the man himself, as the young Bruce Wayne originally loses his parents whilst leaving a movie theatre after seeing The Mask of Zorro. Of course, the idea of Batman being inspired by a flamboyant buckler of swashes like Zorro doesn't really fit the serious tone of Nolan's interpretation, so in Batman Begins we have the Waynes leaving an opera house during an early production of Mephistophel, which only really serves the story to reinforce Bruce's fear of bats. Overall, the goal with Christopher Nolan's approach to Batman seems to be a fairly simple one: deconstruct what makes Batman interesting as a character. However, there is an inherent problem with deconstructionism itself, and that is that it doesn't really add anything new to the character. Instead, what it does is it finds new things within what's already there. In alchemical terms, this process is referred to as solve et coagula. Solve is basically analysis, taking an object apart and examining how it works, whereas coagulate is taking the disassembled pieces and putting them back together in a way that makes the object more efficient, aka synthesis. Christopher Nolan's deconstructionist attitude can be seen through individual elements within the movie itself, albeit symbolically. The death of Bruce Wayne's parents destroys Bruce as a child. His fear of bats is then destroyed by Ra's al Ghul, which is eventually demonstrated visually by having Bruce revisit the cave that he fell into as a child and standing amongst a swarm of bats. And at the end, Bruce destroys himself and his family's name to some extent in front of his dinner guests at the party, which is then followed up in turn by Ra's al Ghul destroying his mansion by burning it to the ground. And what holds these three moments together is the repeated sentiment, why do we fall so we can pick ourselves up again? Solve et coagula, as expressed by two of the three father figures in the movie. Interestingly enough, the three father figures could probably be seen as elements of Bruce Wayne's psyche. His actual father, Thomas Wayne, tells him as he lays dying not to be afraid, a key component to the creation of Batman as well as establishing one of the major themes. Then after the loss of his main father figure, Bruce's influence is then split into two, between Alfred Pennyworth, the Wayne family butler, symbol of Bruce's heritage as well as emotional support and stability, and Ra's al Ghul, a master assassin and leader of a clandestine terrorist organisation who symbolises Bruce's aggression and drive to strike back against the cruel and powerful system that fractured him. What's interesting is that Bruce manages to strike a balance between these two stools in the form of Batman, but only one of the two can ultimately win over Bruce's soul. His decision is made when he stares up at the fire destroying his home, the same symbolic fire that destroyed Ra's al Ghul's home, and Alfred explicitly tells him that he never gave up on him. But like I said though, the realism stuff does end up having some fairly iffy results at times. For example, it always struck me as a little more than redundant to shoot Gotham largely on location like they would end up doing more so in the subsequent films, effectively swapping out the usual lush gothic industrial production design that dominated the Tim Burton movies for something that you could probably gaze at if you just looked out your fucking window. Still, there's really interesting stuff that holds everything together in a terrific sense of grounding in the script, serving up a complicated but overall relatively easy premise to follow, something previously unseen in prior films. What we effectively have here is a detective trail of bad guys scattered over the film's structure. The immediate bad guy, as per the origin story, is Joe Chill, but upon the revelation that Gotham's corruption is frying much bigger fish, he turns his attention to bad guy number 2, Carmine Falcone, who basically at this point runs all of Gotham's underworld that serves as the structural roots of Gotham itself. In other words, the corruption has drained upwards towards the police and the politicians. But after a long segment of soul-searching for Bruce Wayne to build himself up to the level where he can tackle the scale of the problem as he perceives it, we're then served a red herring bad guy in the form of Ken Watanabe's Ra's al Ghul. And it also turns out that Falcone is carrying out his operation at the behest of Arkham psychiatrist Jonathan Crane, aka the Scarecrow. But when Batman eventually deals with the Scarecrow problem, that ends up giving way to the movie's final curtains up reveal, in the form of the final bad guy being Liam Neeson's Henry Ducard, whom was originally positioned as a mentor figure who turns out to be the real Ra's al Ghul who's been running the show the whole time. The show in question is a mass poisoning of Gotham's water supply with Scarecrow's fear agent, with the hopes that the city will symbolically tear itself apart out of utter madness. When you have a screenplay like that, you more or less have all your bases covered. You've got character introspection to build up the central protagonist, you've got a large unwinding mystery peppered through the narrative to keep the audience engaged through that introspection, you've got a great selection of recognisable characters from the Batman universe, so then fan persons of all kinds can gush all over them all over the internet, and you've got a fantastic setting for a big final rousing action scene. In other words, screenplay-wise at least, it's a movie that balances well. Layering onto that some marvellously put-together production design from Lee Crowley, Wally Pfister's elegant and meticulous cinematography, and Harry Gregson-Williams and Hans Zimmer's trend-setting score, and yeah, you've got yourself a pretty solidly crafted piece of mass entertainment. Now, if that's all the movie was in terms of a big summer movie, we'd still be onto a hit, but as previously mentioned, Christopher Nolan and David Goyer have much more interesting things on their minds than simply delivering another one of these. After all, if they hadn't, then this thing wouldn't have been as influential as it debatably has. If Batman Begins wasn't influential in terms of its aesthetic, then it certainly was in terms of its screenplay. I mean, to put things into perspective, I've probably seen Batman Begins about 25 times now, and the last time I actually saw this movie was about 4 years ago. I think one of the most fascinating departures that Batman Begins takes from other depictions of Batman in other media is that even though Batman is always seen as a vengeful force against evil in the classical sense of the term vigilante, in Batman Begins, Alfred repeatedly tells Bruce not to make his actions as Batman personal. This is radical because Batman has essentially been depicted from 1986 onwards as a borderline sociopath, wholly driven by the death of his parents to curb stomp criminals in an attempt to satisfy his own guilt complex. Batman Begins makes a rather fascinating attempt to subvert that. Basically, here's how it goes down. Bruce watches his parents die at the hands of Joe Chill as a child, then several years later, as an adult, he goes on a single-minded quest to avenge that death before receiving a stern talking to about the very nature of criminality, which sets him on a much wider crime-fighting path. In summary, Bruce learns not to want to destroy people like Joe Chill, but instead destroy the system that allowed people like Joe Chill to exist in the first place. The real villain of the piece isn't like the previous movies where it's one or more lunatics with a convoluted plan. It's a vast and complex web of fear, corruption and power with 4 figureheads at the helm, which subtly suggests to the audience that perhaps a different kind of Batman is what's required. Having said that though, I suppose the big problem ethically is that if history has taught us anything, it's taught us that high-minded individuals standing above the law using their powers to single-handedly save the world and ostensibly remake it in their own image has never, ever, ever worked. Raskolnikov, anyone? But still though, think about how huge that is. Batman, as a figure of pop culture iconography, has actually matured. Bruce Wayne isn't just being Batman to fulfill his own personal revenge fantasy, he chooses to be Batman because as Batman he has the potential to do some genuine good in the world. It's one of the reasons why the traditional Batman broods like a motherfucker over the death of his parents isn't at all really brought up in the subsequent 2 films because it was already dealt with here. When you put it into perspective, Batman is essentially a costume, a suit, ultimately the symbol of the person who wears it. In putting together his new Batman, Christopher Nolan is more interested in the man under the suit than the suit itself, and he understands that Bruce Wayne is a much more important character in the Batman mythos because Batman is an aspect of Bruce Wayne's personality. personality, which is why I personally don't think it's a valid criticism to say that it takes 45 minutes for Batman to begin, because it's ultimately Bruce Wayne that has to begin before Batman does. On the downside, it also means the series progression forward is in direct proportion to how much Bruce Wayne is on screen rather than Batman. You know, the one you'd spend upwards of £8 to see. With all that said though, it is still a valid conversation to have in regards to pitch dark reworkings of characters who were ostensibly created to satisfy the needs of children. Admittedly though, reworking characters to mean different things to different people in different decades is something that fiction has been doing for centuries now. Superman, for example, was originally created as an escapist fantasy by two science fiction fans who grew up as children of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania, and it was only until World War II that Superman was reworked by DC Comics as a figure of Western values and American exceptionalism, adding truth, justice and the American way to his mantra in the process, and so on and so on and so on down the line until... well, yeah. But anyway, the point still stands and the argument is still valid. Batman effectively began in 1939 and ended up being particularly popular during the Great Depression, presumably because many children who were reading about his adventures at the time had fathers who were either away all the time because they were looking for work, or even worse, dead. And Batman could function as something of a surrogate father figure through fiction, which more or less resulted in the creation of a child sidekick in the form of Robin. This version of Batman worked for a time, but like it or not, this version of Batman would largely be an anachronism in the 21st century. The Batman of the 40s fought Nazis and gangsters a lot of the time. The 60s Adam West incarnation of the Cape Crusader was campy and psychedelic. 80s Batman comics, by contrast, were grim, gritty, often brutal, and featured the political enemies, such as fascists, religious extremists, and Ronald Reagan, that writers such as Frank Miller and Alan Moore considered the real threats of the day. Likewise, in Batman Begins, written at some point in 2003 to 2004 amidst post-9/11 paranoia, Batman is fighting Ra's al Ghul, who is depicted as a radical ideological terrorist setting off a WMD in an American city, not unlike What's-His-Face and them lot. Consider the people you know and the interpretations of Batman that they enjoy. Comic book fans in their 30s very much enjoy the Michael Keaton Batman because he was their Batman. Similarly, this is why Christian Bale was so fondly thought of, is because he very much is the Batman of now. And even though both versions of Batman are notably distinct, both of them don't invalidate each other, because both of them, and all other versions of Batman for that matter, are the same character but just in different flavours. Generationally, characters broadly mean different things for different people. Iron Man originally got his injuries in Vietnam, which have now been retconned to Afghanistan to reflect modern times. Peter Parker in the comics started out as being an archetypical dweeby science nerd, but in the current Amazing Spider-Man movies he's been reworked into a cross between a Michael Cera-inspired skater kid and Edward Cullen because cynical marketing, it seems. So if Christopher Nolan's aim was to create a more high-minded and mature approach to Batman, which the fans seem to be very much on board with, surely the art crowd would be on board as well, right? Well, yes and no. In one particular example we'll look at, legendary auteur-filmmaker David Cronenberg, who made these, has been somewhat outspoken in his lukewarm feelings towards Nolan's Batman movies, but not really Nolan specifically, as he was asked during a press junket for his film Cosmopolis around the time The Dark Knight Rises was already out whether or not he'd be interested in making a comic book movie, which I'll remind you, he technically already did. Cronenberg's response was, "I still just think it's Batman running around in a stupid cape. I just don't think they're elevated. Christopher Nolan's best movie is Memento, and that is an interesting movie. I don't think his Batman movies are half as interesting, though they're 20 million times the expense." And also adding, a superhero movie, by definition, you know, it's comic book, it's for kids, it's adolescent in its core. That's always been its appeal, and I don't think people who are saying, you know, Dark Knight Rises is, you know, supreme cinema art, I don't think they know what the fuck they're talking about. Now, before all of you start queuing up to take it in turns to piss through David Cronenberg's letterbox, let me explain. In the case of Cronenberg, we're not just talking about some old crank who just doesn't get comic books or whatever. David Cronenberg is generally considered to be one of the best filmmakers currently working in the industry today, at least in terms of the artistic side of the community, and he's been around long enough and paid enough dues that he's earned himself a respectable reputation amongst critics and other admirers that when he speaks, ears prick up, and his voice generally gets heard pretty clearly in the art world. Incidentally, I'm not defending David Cronenberg at all, by the way. I outright disagree with his opinion. I'm just trying to provide a context for those who watch this show and aren't familiar with the man himself, rather than just dressing down a guy whose work you've probably not heard of, effectively turning him into some kind of straw man. Are we clear? Cool, so here's our rebuttal. The trouble with this argument is that it's built around the somewhat facile assumption that nothing with lowbrow roots can contain higher-brow elements, or that no genre with lowbrow origins can ever reach greater heights. Yeah, comic books originated as pulpy escapism for kids, but consider this. Opera originated as a way to, using an absurdly gratuitous and or melodramatic story as a vestigial connective tissue, string catchy songs together for the entertainment of drunk Italian noblemen. Then it developed, in fact, into popular entertainment. Its reputation as the preserver of the intellectually refined is more of a recent development. Not to say that comic book heroes are the new opera. Opera's the new opera, and opera's doing just fine, don't you worry. But an artistic genre, like Bruce Wayne, is not the slave of its origin story. It can grow and evolve and become more than it was expected to be. Don't get me wrong, if you think The Dark Knight is the greatest movie of all time, then you seriously need to sit down and watch any number of these. But if you don't think that a somewhat gratuitous medium such as comic adaptations can produce high art, why not consider other equally lowbrow mediums like, I don't know, war films, a genre which started off as smug Allied propaganda and still frequently produces dull works of jingoistic triumphantism, but good writers and good directors can tell great stories, explore great ideas, ideas within its confines. The thing is, if Cronenberg had just said that people who overrate the Nolan Batman movies need to broaden their horizons, most people probably would have agreed. Or he could have explained specifically how he thinks the ideas and themes of these films could be in any way limited or undermined by the genre that these films inhabit, but instead he just sank into a broad dismissal of an area of cinema he seems to find is somehow beneath him, and any intelligent point he might have been trying to make is obscured. At the end of the day, any genre piece in a given medium needs to be analysed as fairly as possible as an artistic work full stop, as an artistic work within its own medium and as an artistic work within its own genre. Disliking a superhero movie for being a superhero movie is a bit like hating The Sound of Music because, oh, people don't burst into song in real life, that doesn't make any sense. They wouldn't do that in The Third Man. I've always made it a personal rule of thumb in my own written columns that I'm not allowed to criticise something for it not being what I wanted it to be, and instead I have to criticise it for what it is. Still, other people seem to generally get this, and the film was pretty well received by most critics, who appreciated finally getting a Batman film with some brains in it. Roger Ebert awarded Batman Begins a perfect 4 out of 4 stars in his own review, saying, "This is the Batman movie I've been waiting for. More correctly, this is the movie I didn't realise I was waiting for, because I didn't realise that more emphasis on story and character and less emphasis on high-tech action was just what was needed. The movie works dramatically in addition to being entertainment. There's something to it." And many other critics appear to be saying the exact same thing. My only real main problem with Batman Begins is that you can to an extent tell that this is Christopher Nolan's first really big movie, as his directing style seems to really strain under the weight of a production that has to accommodate for shooting in several continents, for a script that contains small character building moments, fight sequences, grand location footage, various kinds of pyrotechnics, elaborate in-camera practical effects, and a gigantic city-wide final action set piece at the climax. Character-wise, everyone is surprisingly well-rounded, including even the bit part players, even though the weak link is almost certainly Katie Holmes as Rachel Dawes, although it helps to know that this character was originally meant to be Harvey Dent, who was then excised from the script and rewritten when they realised they couldn't portray Dent properly yet. Although I will also make the point that the lack of female representation in Christopher Nolan's movies has always been a problem, and one that we'll be getting more into as this retrospective continues. Batman Begins, of course, ended up being a massive critical and commercial hit for Warner Brothers, and considering the fact that other comic book movies that were out at the same time were struggling to recapture the Blade, X-Men, Spider-Man 1, 2, 3 knockout punches that kicked off the revitalisation of the genre in the first place, the writing was on the wall. Grounded, realism-driven superhero pictures were what make money in summer blockbusters these days. In summary, I think that we can safely say that for better or for worse, in terms of redefining the superhero genre to the degree that this movie did, it wasn't just Batman that began here. So when it comes to the recent trend of dark superheroes and realism in popular culture, I think Alan Moore put it best. With Solve et Coagula, now that we know how everything works, it would be nice if we put some of the pieces back together. And on that note, I call it case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, that was Batman Begins, and join us next time when we talk about The Prestige.